Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I'm very pleased and happy to have these two fine gentlemen on my program. Paul DeBarthe, you may recognize him. He's been on my program a couple times. Many of you know him through the I Dig Nauvoo program that's going on. I actually filmed something with him on site a couple times, which was really exciting. And he is the lead, he's been the lead archaeologist at Nauvoo for the Community of Christ since 2012, and really is just doing some awesome work. And before I tell you more about Paul, welcome back to the program, sir.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be welcomed on your program and pleasure to chat with your fine audience. Happy to share the history that we have been working on together.
So right now, actually, what's interesting is that Paul is currently, where are you at right now?
I'm the site director at the Joseph Smith III home in Lamoni, Iowa. I just moved in yesterday, and so there's no pictures on my walls, but you see that I am in the house across the street. And so I'm part-time resident of Lamoni, Iowa, and still a part-time resident of Kansas, but I'm expecting to spend the next several years here, hopefully being able to pull together the archaeology so that we can have the Joseph Smith III home restored to its 1890s situation.
Well, sir, I have to tell you, if I find my way out there, I think I might come by and crash on your couch if you don't mind.
I have an extra bedroom, no bed, but I have an extra bedroom.
All right, well, maybe get me a cot or a blow-up bed.
I have a recliner chair.
Well, that's great. Yeah, and so you've done a lot of work, as a matter of fact. Before doing the I Dig Nauvoo, you were actually doing stuff for the University of Missouri from what, 1970 to what, 71 till
Yeah, I was in the field school in 1971 with Robert T. Bray, and then went back as his assistant from 1975 to 84. And basically, he continued to be the primary archaeologist, and I was the archaeologist on site.
So this is the key thing, folks. This guy, he knows his stuff. He gets his hands dirty, literally, by digging. And recently, you just came out with your book, Hans Mills Hamlet, a Phase 3 archaeological investigation. My friend Allison Biggers, you sent her a copy of this. She really appreciated it. And we did discuss your book on one of our interviews with Pastor Jeff McCullough of Hello Saints. Thanks, Paul, for telling us a little bit about your background. I think it's really important for all of you, especially those of you who are Utah-based saints, probably don't know a whole lot of what's going on in Independence and Nauvoo, and also the great work that the Community of Christ is doing. Of course, we all know the great work that Lachlan Mackay does, and Barbara Walden and others, and of course the whole Joseph Smith photo. This is all coming out of the Community of Christ. They're doing tremendous scholarship and really helping shed light on previously unknown aspects of the restoration. So we are now joined by Paul's brother David, which is his first time here on the program. Now, I want to tell everybody that I know David. I've known David for years. And how do I know David for years is because for a very, very long time, before I even started my channel, I attended almost every single Monday night the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. And I'm going to leave a link for an email address. So those of you who'd like to join the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum, they meet every Monday night, rain or shine, holidays, doesn't matter, at 7 o'clock Mountain Time, 8 o'clock East, Mountain Time, right? Yeah, 7 o'clock Mountain Time, 8 o'clock Central. And it's a forum. And I'll tell you, it's a who's who. It's a great group of people. And really, the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum was invaluable to me to really engage believers in the Book of Mormon. As an outsider, I really didn't know anybody. I didn't know a Mormon until a little shortly before I started my channel. And so or a Book of Mormon believer for that matter. So this group is wonderful. I strongly endorse it. Unfortunately, because my channel's gotten so it's exploded, I'm usually worn out by 9 o'clock Monday night. I'm usually pretty worn out, so I don't get on to those Zoom calls as much. And that's one of the things I actually miss. But David is an active participant in the group. Just to tell you a little bit, for the last 10 years, David has been the primary caregiver for his wife, and that's been his main priority in life. But it hasn't prevented him from being an active elder in the Community of Christ. And he spent 37 years at Graceland University. What did you do at Graceland, David? And by the way, Graceland University is the church. It's the BYU, if you will, of the Community of Christ.
Except I think the church takes more of a arm's length, hands off to the university. You know, they're looking over our shoulder, telling us what we're teaching or anything that along those lines. It's a very liberal arts institution, non-sectarian. And I spent 37 years in the computer center, various responsibilities, many of those years as the director. So that's where I spent that 37 years. I got to tell you, Steve, I didn't tell you in my introduction before, but I retired in 2013 and was able to spend some time with Paul in the archaeology digs at Nauvoo. And I think my most significant contribution was assisting in the processing for helping people volunteer to become archaeologists on site, in a sense. You come in for a day, we'll let you spend time in the dig. I will work with you to make sure you understand what it means to dig, because once you dig a hole, all you got left is a hole. So you got to make sure you do a good job of record keeping, and worked out a system where the volunteer would be able to dig a level, and then they could wash, if that's the proper word, clean their artifacts and catalog their artifacts. And so by the time they left, they had gone through the whole process of the archaeology down to the recording of the artifacts. And so that also solved some real problems for us on how do you get the artifacts taken care of. If you talk to archaeologists, you'll discover that universally you'll find that their artifacts are kind of in storage needing to be processed, but they never get around to processing the artifacts because they don't have time. And so I worked with Paul to work out a system where by the time the volunteer leaves, the artifacts they exposed have been identified, cleaned, and labeled so that they understand that process. And we then can take the artifacts and do whatever analysis we want to do because we have the artifacts already identified in such a way they're usable.
Okay, and this is the thing, is you got your master's in earth sciences. And so this is the key thing, is that Paul and David have expertise in this field. And the reason why I asked them to come on the program is because, folks, the story that Nauvoo was once a swamp apparently is not true. It's actually kind of folklore. And these gentlemen have done archaeological work to show, and Paul, David is going to give his presentation, and we're actually going to have the computer read it out. So it's about a 30-minute presentation, and it's going to show point by point that basically the story that you understood as people envision this history of Nauvoo, that it was a swamp, it doesn't quite hold water. So we're going to drain the swamp, if you will, and and tell the real story of the actual landscape of Nauvoo as it was settled by the saints in the early days. Dave, was there anything that you wanted to say beforehand before you gave the presentation?
Oh, I don't know that we'll talk too much about what they actually found, but we'll show that it was not a swamp.
We're going to show that it's not a swamp. Okay, Paul, before we get started, so we're gonna have do the presentation. I think this is really important. I really love it when we can get some good scholarship on this program and expose it to a layperson audience. A lot of this stuff can be very niche, and I like to bring scholars on to talk to lay people so that they can find out what the latest research is. Paul, was there anything you wanted to say before we started the presentation?
We are using the term pseudoswampology.
Okay.
That is a term that will be, well, because it's just something we created, not something that you're going to find in the dictionary, I think. But if you understand that pseudo is generally understood to be false, then we're looking then at the evidences about the swamp information. And so please understand that our coining of the term is primarily an attempt to get people's attention to the fact that our traditions tend to dominate our thinking. And when we run up with the evidence, we may have to rethink.
Okay, well, that's great. I love it. That's the thing, is that we want to uncover the truth. We want to look at all the evidence and what it actually says, and that's really part of our seeking for answers and looking and learning and educating ourselves. As Doctrines and Covenants says, I believe, the glory of God is intelligence. And I think that's a real important thing, is to continue to learn and grow as a species. All right, David, you ready to go and do the screen share?
I think so.
There we go. All right, so what we're going to do is it's actually going to be read out. And this is the presentation by David and Paul DeBarthe. Pseudoswampology. I like that. Let's get her rolling.
Nauvoo Swamp, a Beautiful Place. By David DeBarthe and Paul DeBarthe. Historical information often gains credibility by the addition of archaeological investigations. Sometimes significant adjustment to historic accounts result from their marriage with archaeology. We hope to see such an adjustment to the Nauvoo swamp tradition as a result of their investigations. Numerous historical references call Nauvoo a swamp. Joseph Smith Jr. referred to it as a beautiful place. Archaeological investigations and geological understandings support Joseph Smith's idea of a beautiful place more than the idea of it being a swamp. He described it to J.C. Bennett in his letter of invitation. Our principal location is at this place, Nauvoo, formerly Commerce, which is beautifully situated on the banks of the Mississippi, immediately above the lower rapids, and is probably the best and most beautiful site for a city on the river. It has a gradual ascent from the river nearly a mile, then a fine level and fertile prairie, a situation in every respect adapted to commercial and agricultural purposes, but like all other places on the river, is sickly in summer. Archaeological and geological research does not support the concept that a true swamp existed on the terrace above the Mississippi that provided the site for Nauvoo. At least it was not a wetland that existed for hundreds of years, let alone decades. There are numerous historical records of the Mormons draining the swamp. It would appear that instead of a true swamp, there were scattered slow drainage areas individuals drained, and their historical record has been expanded to say that Nauvoo was located in a swamp. The geology of the Nauvoo terrace does not work for development of a swamp. The use of the term swamp becomes a misconstruction for the city of Nauvoo because of the question of truly stagnant bodies of water. True swamps always occur in either a basin, in a wide floodplain next to a meandering river, as in a Yazoo tributary, or associated with a river oxbow. Swamps occur along the lower Mississippi where it sluggishly meanders to build oxbows, in a region of swampy land trapped by the natural river embankment built by the slow-flowing river in flood stage. This embankment prevents the water from flowing back into the river, thus forming a swamp at or below the river level. To permanently drain a swamp, you must remove the barrier that keeps the water from naturally flowing to the larger body. The terrace has no natural barrier and is not shaped as a basin but slopes from east to west toward the river. Nauvoo, between two bluffs, and on a terrace 20 feet above a river rapids, does not geologically match a landform for a swamp. Absence of organics, swamps stagnate enough that organic material builds up over ages. Archaeological investigations at Nauvoo of soil profiles have shown no layered humus one expects to find deposited by a swamp. The upper portion of the soil profiles have been mixed by nearly 200 years of plowing and gardening from the city of Nauvoo, plus erosion carrying sediments from above the bluff out over the flats. An undisturbed swamp deposit would have been laid down over many ages, reaching well below the plow zone, which is limited to the top foot. Coal and peat developed from organic material deposited by ancient swamps in their anaerobic, oxygen-free environment. A geologically newly created swamp on the terrace overlooking rapids may fit the swamp tradition, but it does not fit the geology. Soil porosity. There are areas today where in the spring, water is retained enough that mowing is not possible. By late in May, the natural drainage through these porous soils permits both mowing and archaeological excavations. Irregularity of the limestone subsurface could easily produce spots that don't drain as rapidly as other locations, making them appear swampy. Heavy rainfalls do occur in Nauvoo. Excavated basements, those which have been left exposed, have collected water after heavy rain. However, they have drained out within 1 to 3 days. On August 4th and 5, 2023, the Nauvoo pageant provided a compelling example. A small shower on the first night did not stop the enjoyment of the large crowd at the production, but afterward, became a 7.8-inch cloudburst. 20 hours after the storm, another large crowd of participants, trucks and cars parked on the same 2 blocks of grass utilized the night before, and no one sank into the swamp, mud, or got stuck. The archaeologist, Paul DeBarthe, had the privilege of escorting Mary, Rebecca, and Rebecca, yes, 3 Rebeccas in the same family, in Mormon period gowns with hems close to the ground, to the Saturday evening pageant. Their hems did not get wet. The Durfee
Hey,
ditch
David,
did
can you
carry
stop it for a
rush of
second?
water to the river all day and only drains away water.
I just want to say that the Lakewood Ranch ward here that I'm not a member of, but it's in my territory that I go to. They sent a youth group sent a bus trip, and they were there during that storm, and I actually got to talk to them after they came from that storm. It's quite a thing that went through last summer. So it's interesting to see the history here. This is fascinating. So I'm watching this for the first time, folks, and I'm going to jump in now and then. But it was I can definitely vouch for it. It was quite a storm that came through there. Oh, we're gonna make the on the fly here. We're gonna make make the corrections. That's great. We're seeing scholarship in action here on Mormon Book Reviews.
Let me apologize. I don't have a picture of the 4 ladies in their Mormon period costumes, but these are the 4 ladies who planted 10,000 flowers last spring and
Wow.
then made gardens at the mansion house on the Nauvoo dig site and Burlington in Mount Pleasant. They're just, and they've been coming for 10 years to work on the archaeology project. And so I wanted to highlight and honor the Armstrong ladies because they've been tremendous helpers on the project.
That's great. It's so awesome what your group is doing, Paul. The work you're doing. I want to praise it. All right, David. Whenever you're ready.
Okay.
The Duffy ditch did carry a rush of water to the river all day and only drains away water coming from the bluff. That was substantially to the south of the pageant site. There have been efforts to facilitate drainage in Nauvoo, and they have expedited removal of the temporary surface water. However, the 7+ inch rainfall absorbed in 20 hours defies the repeated mythology of the swamp. The irony of being repeatedly instructed about the swamp while sitting high and dry where the swamp was supposed to be, shortly after a deluge, stimulated this article. Buried limestone outcrops. There have been claims that the limestone immediately under the terrace is impermeable to water, thus making the groundwater table at the surface producing a swamp. The Mississippian-aged limestone is known for its layers, fissures, massive formations, and caves. When Robert T. Bray of the University of Missouri at Columbia conducted his tests on Block 149 in 1975, he found with the trencher that a great deal of irregularity appeared. The trencher would dig down to 3 and 4 feet deep and then bounce up to 2 feet when it hit the limestone outliers. Water table issues. The water table would be primarily regulated by the level of the Mississippi River. When in 1841, the Nauvoo house construction began at the edge of the terrace, the water level of the Mississippi was some 20 feet below it. The historical record shows that Joseph and Hiram Smith were buried in the basement of the Nauvoo house in 1844. The water table was obviously not at the surface. The Nauvoo house modified by Major Bidama in the 1870s has only a crawl space. The dam at Keokuk raised the river level some 20 feet, and only a couple of feet difference exists between the level of the river and the floor of the Nauvoo house. The crawl space remains wet because the water table closely matches the river level. Pumping water from the crawl space. The water table in the mansion house well. When in 1978, the archaeologists cleared the mansion house well, with its surface about 10 feet above the floor level of the Nauvoo house, they encountered the water table at 12 feet. The archaeologist had to pump out the water in order to clean down to the 28-foot depth of the original construction. It took 2 pumps since a single pump was not sufficient to keep up with the inflow of water. It is very difficult to drain a water table and almost impossible to do so on a permanent basis. The depth of the well probably most accurately marks the water table of 1843 to 44. Interestingly, Joseph Smith paid $28 for digging a 28-foot deep well. Typically, the well diggers would stop digging a few feet below hitting water. The proprietor, at a good day's wage per foot, did not want to pay for digging far beyond the water level. Therefore, the archaeologist concludes that the water table level, in 1843 to 44, could not have been at the surface of the flat, which is essential for a true swamp, but was closer to river level, some 20 feet lower. There also was a pre-Mormon well at the homestead site and numerous other wells during Mormon occupation. There was a well started at the homestead site during the Hugh White occupation. Because of the greatly increased population and the greater need for water, it was expanded during Smith's occupation to approximately the same depth, 32 feet. It was required to dynamite limestone to reach a good pool of water when expanding this well. This demonstrated that good water existed within the limestone strata. The Durfee ditch would not have had an impact on the water table at these well sites. The natural ditch intervened.
Dave,
All
why
were
don't you
near
stop
the
there,
mansion
please?
house well.
Yeah, go back. Let's give emphasis there to Alma Blair. The Alma Blair picture, I think, is one that many people will, if not recognize, at least appreciate, because he has been very much involved in Mormon history throughout his lifetime as a professor. And here's a picture of him, the gentleman standing on the right by the mansion house well, talking with a couple of Mormon visitors, and a little boy on the bicycle, I believe, is Jared Fears, who now is retired. But the idea that Alma Blair is one of the historians involved in our research, and he is the one who helped to restore the Joseph Smith III house where I'm working now.
Oh, okay, great. Great. Interesting. Yeah. And was Alma a member of the Community of Christ or the
Yes.
okay. I love seeing Book of Mormon names. Uh, people named after Book of Mormon people. I always love that. So where are we? Well, we're going to the. Is it? Okay. Oh, we got to go to the next page then. Yeah, we've already done this
We're on
one.
the next page. Let's see.
Yep. So, yeah, we're just.
There it is. Hang on a minute.
So, folks, you just get to see this on our program. Just we're fixing it as we go along. This is how scholarship works. All right. So now let's.
And that's and that's critical to us that the water table itself would have been down about river level,
Right.
as proven by the well, not at the surface. Therefore, you could not possibly have a swamp if the water table was 20 feet lower than the surface.
And
David,
just
don't go on yet. Go back and point out the well here in that second picture.
uh-huh.
Okay, the tripod is over the mansion house well.
Okay.
That's up on the terrace. They go down the next picture to the homestead. The well in the homestead, David, yeah, there's the well.
Okay.
That well was begun during the Hugh White residence, pre-Mormon. And
Okay.
Joseph III tells of stepping out of the doorway to the left there as a blast of black powder went through the limestone, and a big stone came down from above his head and brushed his cap as it landed at his feet just beside that door.
Huh. So just to be clear here, the water table is higher now because they built a dam, right? Is that what we're in?
Right.
So we know what the water table was then was during Joseph's time because of how deep the wells were dug. And so that's the point you're trying to get across there.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's very difficult. It doesn't make very good sense to dig a well in a swamp.
Right. Yep. Good point. Okay, let's continue.
Prehistoric occupants. When Joseph Smith named the terrace that began 20 feet above the Mississippi River and associated highlands, Nauvoo, the beautiful city, he may not have recognized the area had been seen by mankind as a beautiful homeland for thousands of years. On the homestead site in which numerous Mormon artifacts were uncovered, below them in situ were found diagnostic artifacts of the prehistoric occupants. Archaeological investigations at Nauvoo support the site as a beautiful place of residence for more than 5,000 years. The local Burlington Chert projectile point evidence of mammoth hunters 10,000 years ago clearly demonstrates they were on the site. However, the question of whether they resided here remains open. With the archaic bison hunters, roughly 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, residence becomes more evident. The numerous lanceolate projectile points created by the residents at the bend in the river now known as Nauvoo signified it a beautiful place for these intrepid hunters. Not only the points but places where lithic technicians produced them from the local Burlington chert have been uncovered on the terrace. With the head of the Des Moines Rapids providing a shallow zone for crossing the Mississippi River, especially in low water seasons, bison crossing either way could be met by hunters awaiting them on the eastern bank. Thousands of years of prehistoric residents of the terrace above the river, living harmoniously in their environment, utilized the local resources. The archaeologist who mapped the chert debris on the homestead site found a pattern of debitage that matched his cross-leg knees-bent sitting pattern. There was a large triangular pile immediately in front of him and smaller piles to the left and right of his legs. After mapping chert flakes and chips, he realized he was sitting in the same place and posture where a native lithic craftsman about 5,000 years ago had sat, creating a lanceolate projectile point found nearby. The striations on the projectile point matched those on the chert chips and flakes. The archaeologist admired both the similarity of positions of the napper and the mapper and the beautiful sunset over the river. The prospect that his predecessor sitting in the same place facing west shared a sunset experience reflected in the water bound the two across millennia. Neither was sitting in a swamp. By 2,500 years ago, early woodland pottery makers settled on the terrace overlooking the river. Their ceramics, projectile points, awls, scrapers, and their burials attest to a people living on this beautiful bend in the river. Middle woodland mound builders followed, about 2,000 years ago, leaving clear evidence of 1,000 miles of trade goods revealed in a burial ossuary near the Red Brick Store. Dongola chert from Tennessee, antler tools, a dozen oval bifaces, and Catlinite pike from Minnesota, bottom picture, demonstrate the presence of trade goods. They could use the local Burlington chert in vessels made from local clay in exchange for distant trade goods. The location of the terrace at the head of the rapids would make this an important resting point for travelers transiting up and down the Mississippi. The local resources made it an excellent place for these remarkable residents of the terrace, that later became Nauvoo, to host these travelers. Prehistoric burials, on the Smith Homestead block, 2 Aboriginal burial sites, possibly of the same extended family, have been uncovered. The early woodland site, found in 1976, predated the modern era by 2,500 to 2,200 years. West and a little north of the Smith Cemetery, their burial ossuary, dug to a depth of 5 feet, had been covered with logs and limestone. A middle woodland burial, 2,000 to 1,500 BP, found in 1979, a few feet east of the Red Brick Store, not as deep, but was still a burial ossuary in what would not have been a swamp. The revolutionary development of pottery indicates a sedentary lifestyle. The grit-tempered cord-marked pottery of the early woodland evolved into the pottery of the middle woodland. This supports the idea of continuity in the habitation of the terrace. It is interesting to see that both prehistoric and the Mormon people lived on and used the southern edge of the terrace for burying their loved ones, not a logical case if it was a swamp. The Gustavus Hills map published by the Times and Seasons, 1846, shows numerous ancient tumuli, burial mounds, on the terrace. Unfortunately, mounds identified as tumuli often were excavated to pirate tombs within. As often, they have been bulldozed for modern development. Because no scientific excavation was done on any of the tumuli, it is not possible today to know for sure which of the prehistoric periods they represented. Tumuli in the general area have been excavated and dated from 5,000 to 1,000 years ago. Also, mounds and tombs have been found on the bluffs and on the terraces, but not in swamps. First Nations people occupied the site. Population pressure from the invading Europeans converged here. French traders came in from the north and encountered the Spanish from the south. Americans pushed from the east and all met, at least figuratively, on our bend in the river. Captain James White built a stone house at the head of the rapids in 1824 to 1829, some 20 feet above the river. He is credited with purchasing access to the east side of the river, now Nauvoo, in 1824, from the Sac and Fox for 2,000 bushels of corn. The village of about 500 lodges, named for its leader, Washkima, peaceful place, moved to the west side of the river. This shows that the Nauvoo Terrace was populated by First Nations people within 2 decades of when the Mormons moved in. White's son Hugh, whose log house was later occupied by Joseph Smith and his family, appears to have been responsible for a pre-Mormon well and for the basement under the bee house, picture is of the remains of the bee house. Early historic occupants built basements. Archaeological evidence at the basement site of Water and Bain Streets does not support the idea it was a residence or barn or root cellar. The basement had partially deteriorated, requiring refurbishing by the time the Mormons established the Times and Seasons building over it in 1839. Since it had deteriorated, it must have been at least one generation older. The archaeological record has now shown that the pre-Mormon basement was a storage facility, possibly for furs. If the structure had been below the water table, whatever was being stored would have gotten wet. Dennis Julian established a trading post from 1805 to 1819 on the terrace. He was the longest-serving non-First Nations person prior to the Mormons, and would appear most likely to have dug the basement on the terrace.
I want to stop here, Steve, because this presentation is generally tied to one that Paul makes on the Book of Mormon and the Times and Seasons building. So there's quite a bit of data that's not included here that I think is important. This shows the northeast corner of the basement. You can see a line here that proved to be the south edge of a stone stairway that went out this way. The Mormons obviously closed it in. The student here is pointing to a stone that is obviously not original in the basement. We have the rebuilding of the basement. You can't see much of it, but over here we found a builder's trench where the Mormons actually had a builder's trench, and they rebuilt this northeast corner of that basement. And so you can imagine a basement built before the Mormons even got there, storing furs, kind of defeats the idea that they were doing that in a swamp.
Yes, I agree. This is very compelling, by the way. I think this is really showing really good work here, and it has to cause us to have to rewrite our history of Nauvoo. It wasn't the swamp, but let's continue with this presentation because this is really fascinating.
This is a site you visited too, Steve.
Yes, that's right. I was there, and we even came up with some typeset that would have been used to print the 1840 edition of the Book of Mormon. Yeah, it was really cool.
Dennis Julian established a trading post from 1805 to 1819 on the terrace. He was the longest-serving non-First Nations person prior to the Mormons, and would appear most likely to have dug the basement on the terrace. To have built a basement in a swamp would have been unlikely. For him, or possibly another trader, to have dug through the limestone outliers and used them in the drywall construction was the action of someone of permanence. No transient would have done that hard work. No one would have done it in a swamp where the basement would continuously be flooded. The homestead block had 4 basements, one under the keeping room added in 1840, one under the log schoolhouse mentioned in Joseph Smith's 3 memoirs, one under the bee house under which Joseph and Hiram were buried from 1844 to 1928, and one under the red brick store opened in January 1841, pictured. Joseph 3 indicates the one under the log schoolhouse had previously, pre-Mormon, been used for vegetable storage. At least 13 other Mormon-era basements have been identified. The construction of basements where the water table was at the surface and the area was a swamp is not feasible. The water table in the Mormon period could not have been at ground surface level, which is essential for a true swamp. The engineers who wrote Transforming Swampland into Nauvoo, the City Beautiful, A Civil Engineering Perspective, BYU Studies Quarterly, Volume 45, Issue 3, Article 6, in 2006, obviously put a lot of effort to research historical documents to determine exactly what part of the terrace was swampy. They identified 4 areas shown in their Figure 6. The main one of these is where the Mormons created their business district. There was a small one where the Community of Christ Visitors Center now sits immediately adjacent to some natural drainage and probably was a swale. There was one north and west of Brigham Young's house, and one closer to the west edge of the peninsula where the town of Commerce would have been. It is apparent that in the historical accounts the swampy portions were relatively small compared to the rest of the terrace. In any relatively flat area with large amounts of snowmelt and rainfall, there will be standing water for a period of time. Large amounts of vegetation would naturally slow down the drainage of the area. That hardly justifies calling Joseph's beautiful place a swamp. Note, we are awaiting permission to use the engineer's figure 6 before publication of this article. The Durfee Ditch along what is now Highway 69 is approximately 2 blocks west of the Community of Christ Visitor Center and protects 2 blocks east-west by 4 or 5 blocks north-south from runoff from the bluff. The LDS Visitor Center is located just north and east of the largest swampy area where the largest native tumuli is shown on the map and is well north and west of the ditch. The Homestead Block, 155, where Joseph Smith first resided, is located south of the main swampy area and west of the area now occupied by the Community of Christ Visitor Center, Block 146. There is pre-Mormon natural north-south drainage between Block 146 and the Homestead Block to the west. The Nauvoo house opposite the Joseph Smith residences, on Block 156 is lower than the swampy area on Block 146 by 10 feet or more. This offers counterpoint to the claim of the swamp.
I think it's important to point out as we've gone on, we're always continually discovering more information, but the Durfee Ditch was probably the major engineering feat that the Mormons brag about for draining the swamp. It was 10 feet deep and ran, let's see, it should be right there, ran this distance down to the river. But notice we point out that you see this natural drainage ditch coming down through here. So the Durfee Ditch really only drained area that had already been naturally drained, even though it was a 10-foot ditch and a fairly, well, a very strong engineering feat back in the 1840s. But it didn't drain the swamp. It was draining water that was coming off the bluff. And so here, this swamp area out here had nothing to do with the Durfee Ditch. And so the claim that the engineers are making that the Durfee Ditch was a major feature in draining the swamp simply doesn't fit.
Okay.
Because it doesn't fit with the swamp.
Okay, great points.
Let's see, I don't know where that left off.
Yeah, this is,
right
just
there.
go to the next.
Yeah.
Yep, there we go.
Let's go
Yep.
down here.
Disease factor.
Disease factor, mosquitoes were undoubtedly a problem. There would have been plenty of places below the terrace on the edge of the river and on its islands for them to breed, so the presence of mosquitoes does not give evidence for a swamp. Malaria typically is found in warmer regions of the world, in tropical and subtropical countries. Higher temperatures allow the Anopheles mosquito to thrive. Malaria parasites, which grow and develop inside the mosquito, need warmth to complete their growth before they are mature enough to be transmitted to humans. Malaria, ague, passes between humans and other animals by the vector mosquitoes, not between mosquitoes. Therefore, it was probable the widely traveling European humans brought in the diseases to the beautiful bend in the river, not a disease-ridden swamp waited for humans.
And I want to emphasize that again. I got to find stronger ways to say that because it's the claim that it was a disease-infested swamp. Malaria doesn't exist in the Midwest naturally. It's only there because humans who have malaria come into the Midwest, and then the mosquitoes in the Midwest pick up the malaria and pass it around to other humans. But then when winter comes, that parasite that is the malaria parasite can't survive below about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And so Midwest simply doesn't have malaria naturally. And so it was not a disease-infested swamp. It was a area where Europeans tended to come in. We've mentioned that back through there, and they brought their diseases with them.
Okay, well, that's excellent point. And I can attest to being a resident of the Midwest, we do have plenty of mosquitoes, and I didn't live near a swamp, so they are all over the place.
All right.
Historical background. Landowners Alexander White and Joseph Pease established a post office at Venus, which by 1834 was renamed into Commerce. There, 24 lots of the 144 lots fronted on the river, conveniencing warehousing and keel boating above the rapids. On paper, in 1837, Commerce City added 376 lots at $250 each to the north of Commerce. None of these were sold during the Panic of 1837. These urban plans were laid because of wonderful prospects, not because it was a swamp. The use of the term swamps in Nauvoo was evident in the November 1, 1841 action of the City Council. It was unanimously adopted that the swamp directly west of Councillor Brigham Young's house be drained, so soon as circumstances permit. Today, there is no evidence that such action was ever taken and the area would have drained naturally given time. The term swamp was, and still is, used and misused by anyone who has an area that stays wet longer than the rest of the property. Pseudoswamp may be a more appropriate term. Richard Lyman Bushman says, water seeping out of the bluffs along the eastern edge of Marshy Peninsula required the Saints dig a drainage canal, and even then the land was too wet to permit cellars. Evidence of at least one pre-Mormon basement on the homestead site, the Times and Seasons pre-Mormon basement plus numerous Mormon, at least 16 basements now known, speak to the contrary of no cellars. In addition, no archaeology has been done on the Venus and Commerce sites. Benjamin E. Park in Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier, 2020:22, says, though the region was known for its beauty, its environment was difficult to tame. The Saints later recalled it as a wilderness. The standing water in the flats required them to construct a drainage ditch to remove the spring's runoff water. The work became more urgent after an outbreak of malaria the first summer, due to the swampy conditions, that resulted in several deaths. But the water eventually receded, and a new city began to grow. Note that the water is coming from the bluff and not part of a swamp. Mosquitoes can easily be bred on the lowlands by the river and its islands, not in the flat. We credit the historian with a more accurate statement here in the fact that the water receded, and the city was able to grow. With the city plats and the layout of streets with curbs, drainage naturally occurred, accommodating the city growth. Smith's beautiful site for a city on the river observation that it was sickly in the summer acknowledged a problem people attributed to the location. Many of the Mormons settling there referred to the swamp they drained to make the place their home, establishing a myth so often repeated that it has become standard litany for historians, for presentations to tourists at the LDS Visitor Center, and in the pageants. The use of the term swamp for Nauvoo is an exaggeration magnified by historical repetition. Even such notables as Mark Scherer in his The Journey of a People perpetuated the myth. Only in Smith's imagination could this land be called beautiful, since it was a stagnant water swampland with a few abandoned structures. Once you assume swamp, stagnant water automatically is implied. The stagnant water swamp cannot be supported archaeologically nor geologically. Summary: pseudoswamp. Thousands of years of occupation on the Mississippi River bend that became Nauvoo verifies its designation as a beautiful site. The claim for it being a swamp is another matter. Archaeological investigations, prehistoric, pre-Mormon, historic, and of the Mormon period, all raise questions about the characterization of the landform as a swamp. Swamps form when water cannot flow into or back into the slow-moving river because of some impediment. The Nauvoo Terrace is next to the Des Moines Rapids, and there is no impediment to prevent water from flowing into the river. A terrace 20 feet above a river rapids does not geologically match a landform for a swamp. The humus layers expected in a swamp were not found on the terrace at Nauvoo. The fact that prehistoric peoples had buried their dead in tumuli and in ossuaries on the terrace, above the river, even with the bluffs immediately available, demonstrates 2 millennia of pre-Mormon confidence that burials here were placed where they could be remembered and revisited, not in a swamp. Prior to the Mormons occupying the terrace above the river, natives lived there. In 1820, just 20 years before the Mormons, there were about 500 Sac and Fox native lodges in a village on the east side of the river. Yet, historians claim it was a disease-infected swamp. Pre-Mormon Europeans dug a basement for storage, later used for supporting the Second Times and Seasons building at Bain and Water Streets. This basement structure affirms a habitable terrace, not a swamp. 16 known basements dug on the terrace by Mormons defy the claim of a swamp. Spring seasons in Nauvoo tend to be wet. Drainage in 1839 was not fast enough to suit the Mormons. The vegetation held rainwater and snowmelt. They removed trees and shrubs and dug drainage ditches, reducing the swampiness of the site. Mormons then proceeded to dig basements for their houses and root cellars on the terrace. The temporary swampy condition on isolated areas drained, dried, and became indistinguishable from the rest of the terrace. No actual swamp has been demonstrated. The idea of the Nauvoo swamp adjacent to and on a terrace above the Des Moines rapids is not geologically or archaeologically sound. Therefore, as a matter of accuracy in geology, in archaeology, and in tradition, the case for a swamp fits the pattern of mythology better than the pattern for a swamp. Finally, the mythic truth can be sustained without a full-fledged swamp, or perhaps any swamp. There were some small semi-wetlands on the site. For sure, the mosquitoes and malaria were real. Let the swamp in Nauvoo be drained from Mormon history. It will likely continue to exist in mythology.
Excellent. Well, why don't you exit out of screen share there, and let's just chat about this for a couple minutes, because this is really a fascinating thing. This really does rewrite history, Mormon history, because here you are quoting from Benjamin Park, Kingdom of Nauvoo. Here you are quoting from Richard Bushman, I'm assuming Rough Stone Rolling, and you're on other historians, Mark Scherer, Journey of the People. That's the Community of Christ history, right? Is that correct? Yeah. And so here you have like some of the most important Mormon historians who are putting this information out that this was a swamp. So we're going to have to rewrite the narrative. Why? Because the evidence seems to be pretty conclusive that this wasn't a swamp. And I think what shows is that we've had about thousands of years of occupation, burial mounds, structures being built with basements before. And so Joseph Smith got it right. Some people say, oh, Joseph Smith was a con man. He named it that so that he'd attract people to move out there, right? But he knew it was a swamp. No, actually, it was a beautiful place. And I think this is really a cool presentation that you did today, David. Thank you so much.
Let me go back to emphasize that Brigham Young's house was sandwiched between two swamps, according to the civil engineers, immediately adjacent to the swamp number 2 on the west. And in 1843, May of 1843, when Brigham Young built his brick house, which is now available for tour, he had a cellar under it. And Brigham Young put a cellar under his house, sandwiched between two swamps, that really defies the swamps there.
Right. So they really weren't swamps. They were just areas that carried moisture for longer periods of time and could have been confused as being a swamp. They would have called it that, but technically that's not true. And it wasn't a swamp because obviously they wouldn't have been able to do what they were able to do. And so that's really interesting. I think, folks, I just want to say, this is what this channel is all about. I could be doing something about Under the Banner of Heaven last year, doing an after show on that, doing entertainment and Mormon culture. But to me, some of the most important contributions that this channel has been able to make is in the world of Mormon scholarship. Even Thomas Murphy acknowledges this channel in one of his papers for kind of being the impetus for one of the papers that he co-authored with Simon Southerton. And I've also been cited in books and other places as well. So I think it's really important that, there isn't really anybody else doing this. I think a lot of people like to chase the headlines, which is fine, and get the views and the clicks. But to me, some of the most important stuff that this channel's been able to do is to get this kind of information out to the public. Folks, we're going to have to rewrite Mormon history. And this is the first time I sat through this presentation, and I just found it absolutely fascinating. Before I let you guys go, was there anything else, David, that you wanted to?
Yeah, I want to add in there on the Brigham Young site, and it works for all the others. The claim will be made that Brigham Young was able to build his house with a cellar because the Mormons had drained the swamp.
Right. Yeah, that would be.
The point that is missed totally, as far as I'm concerned as a earth scientist, is in order to have a swamp, the water table has to be at the surface. Nothing said about draining the water table. How do you drain a water table?
Yeah. Right.
And since you can't really drain a water table, except over long periods of time, obviously what Brigham Young was dealing with was not a true swamp.
Right.
Also, in my own history, 2014, when I retired, I spent 2 weeks with Paul in Nauvoo. And one of the projects he had me do on the Samuel Smith site was explore for outbuildings using an open-sided probe where we would probe down into the ground and then pull out the soil sample, knowing that if there was a structure there, the soil profile would be different. And we did over 100 soil profiles. Unfortunately, didn't find any more outbuildings, but I noted at that time and made the point, there's no sign of a swamp in any of this soil. 100 probes, and I didn't find a single one that indicated anything about a swamp. And that was what first started me thinking about the history may be wrong. There may not have been a swamp here after all.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, my friend. And just by actually getting your hands dirty and actually doing the digging and not being an armchair quarterback, but actually or armchair archaeologist, actually getting in there and doing the work, which I think is really important. And again, also, folks, I'm gonna have a link in the description to I Dig Nauvoo for those of you who'd like to help participate. Right? Are you going to be in Nauvoo this summer, Paul? Or are you going to be doing Iowa now?
I will be in both. I will be in Nauvoo for the last couple of weeks of May. We have BYU students coming to participate in the excavation, and then Western Illinois University will be conducting the field school in Nauvoo from June 5 till July 15. And so I'll be back periodically to check on that. But I'll be opening an archaeological project here at the Joseph Smith III home site in Lamoni. And right now the plan is for that to be open on Saturdays. So I'll be getting my hands dirty both places.
That is really awesome. I'm
Every
so
place Paul
excited.
goes, he digs in the dirt.
That's great. Well, that's great. You know, and I just really think it's wonderful the work that the Community of Christ and the people associated with the Community of Christ, also, you know, other restorationists that are based out there in Independence, that you guys are really doing a wonderful job at preserving Mormon history. Of course, you do a wonderful job preserving the Kirtland Temple as well in Ohio. I think it's really one of the great achievements of the Community of Christ is its management and oversight of these important historic sites, including the graves of Joseph, Hiram, and Emma. And also I want to honor Lachlan Mackay. I had the opportunity to visit Paul, of course, at the site, the Times and Seasons site that they are excavating. And Lachlan Mackay had a set of keys, and he went and took me and Rick Bennett into rooms and buildings that weren't open to the public. And also that night, we actually stayed at one of the lodges that the Community of Christ operates. And I want to thank the Community of Christ for blessing me. I really feel deep and profound connection to your people. And I think for those of you who are based in Utah and you don't know a whole lot about the Community of Christ, they do some great work. And I really feel it's important that we highlight it. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for coming on. David, thank you so much for putting this presentation together. I hope you all enjoyed it. And folks, in the comments, tell me what you think. Do you think now that this pretty much conclusively proves that it wasn't a swamp and that this is just part of Mormon myth and folklore? I think we've found enough evidence there that seems to indicate that. And if there's other scholars out there that would like to push back, we'd love to hear from you as well. Well, Paul, I am so excited and stoked that you get to be in Lamoni, Iowa, right across the street from Joseph Smith III's home, and you get to do this work. It must be a real privilege for you to feel that to be able to do something like that.
I'm headed across now to take down the Christmas decorations, and we'll be putting together the plans for the 19th century Easter celebration and the activities, the historical activities. We have a one-room country school adjacent to the home where we'll be performing some hands-on history activities for kids in the area. And so we're looking forward to a great opportunity to share widely in our community. So please come take a tour.
Excellent. And David, thank you for coming on. Any final words?
Thank you for having us. I mentioned Paul and I both attended a one-room country school. There's almost 10 years difference in our age, but back then we attended a one-room country school a few years apart. And so we have some history with that kind of thing where we can tell real life stories about what it's like to go to school in a one-room country school.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Well, folks, tell us what you think about it. There are links in the description to what we'll talk with some of the stuff that we talked about in today's episode. I'll include the I Dig Nauvoo website as well as the Community of Christ website. And Paul, if you want to send me any links, that would be great as well. Also, for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel, there are places that you can donate to the channel. Of course, we also have our merchandise store, MormonBookReviews.com, where you can buy hats and t-shirts and assorted things as well. But remember, this is the most important thing, is this. Remember, all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.